In the spring of 1867, a federal investigator named Charles Whitfield rode into the Mississippi Delta to inspect what official records described as an abandoned cotton plantation. Dispatched from the district office in Jackson, his assignment was routine: verify dissolution paperwork, confirm compliance, and move on. The job usually meant little more than skimming dusty ledgers and exchanging signatures with bored county clerks. Instead, it became the defining ordeal of his career and a memory that would shadow him for the remaining 3 decades of his life. The property was known as the Greenvale Estate. According to the Federal Registry, it had been formally dissolved on January 3, 1866. Files submitted to the Freedmen's Bureau stated that all formerly enslaved individuals had been issued freedom papers, labor contracts had been settled, and the land cleared for public auction. The case bore the final stamp, closed, compliance verified. But as Whitfield followed their long, oak-lined drive toward the main house, the paperwork unraveled before his eyes. Smoke rose from dozens of chimneys. The air carried voices of men calling out across fields, women speaking from doorways, children laughing nearby. He heard the steady thud of axes splitting wood. As the estate came fully into view, he saw people working the fields that stretched to the horizon, their movements eerily synchronized in a rhythm anyone familiar with plantation labor would recognize. Whitfield had spent 2 years traveling across Mississippi, enforcing federal emancipation requirements. He had seen every form of defiance imaginable: planters who abandoned their land in bitterness, others who paid starvation wages while clinging to old hierarchies, and many who exploited loopholes in labor contracts to preserve control. But this was something else entirely. Before him stood a plantation operating at full capacity, hundreds of people living and laboring on land that, on paper, no longer existed. 2 years after its official closure, Greenvale Estate functioned as though emancipation had never occurred, and according to the records, it should have been impossible. Freed, he spent that first day conducting a preliminary count. 347 people, men, women, children, elderly, all black, all living in the same cabins that had housed enslaved workers before the war, all subject to the authority of a white overseer who watched Whitfield with suspicious eyes. When Whitfield demanded to speak with whoever owned the property, he was brought to a man named Virgil Hayes, a name that appeared nowhere in the federal dissolution records. Hayes greeted him with elaborate courtesy, offered refreshments, and calmly explained that there had been administrative confusion regarding the property's status. "These people are free laborers under contract," Hayes said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. "Every single one has freedom papers. I can produce documentation for each individual if you'd like." Whitfield said he would very much like to see that documentation. Over the following week, as Whitfield interviewed workers and examined papers, he began to understand that something far more sophisticated than simple defiance of federal law was happening at Greenville. The workers had freedom papers, documents that looked official, bore government stamps, and contained all the proper legal language. They had labor contracts that appeared on surface examination to be legitimate free labor agreements. They received wages, or at least Hayes's ledgers claimed they did. But when Whitfield spoke privately with the workers, he heard a different story. He heard about promises that evaporated like morning dew. He heard about debts that multiplied faster than wages could pay them down. He heard about people who'd left Greenville and vanished completely as if the earth had swallowed them. He heard fear in voices that should have been speaking with the confidence of free citizens. On his 9th day at Greenvale, Whitfield sent a telegram to his superiors in Jackson. The message was urgent. "Greenvale Estate situation requires immediate investigation. Evidence of systematic fraud and possible kidnapping. Request federal marshals." The response came 2 days later. "Stand by for instructions." Whitfield never received those instructions. On his 12th night at Greenville, while staying at a boarding house in nearby Greenville, he was attacked in his room. 3 men with covered faces beat him severely, broke his right hand, and delivered a message. Go back to Jackson. Forget Greenale. There are things here you don't understand. Whitfield recovered enough to travel and returned to Jackson, where he filed a comprehensive report detailing everything he'd discovered. The report was 47 pages long, included witness testimony from 16 workers, and concluded with a recommendation for immediate federal intervention. The report was filed under pending review and locked in a cabinet. 3 weeks later, Whitfield was reassigned to administrative duties in the Jackson office, forbidden from further field investigations. When he protested, his supervisor, a man named Edmonds, who'd served in the Union Army and claimed to support Reconstruction, told him flatly, "There are political considerations you're not aware of. The Greenvale matter is being handled at a higher level." It wasn't. Whitfield checked periodically over the following months using what limited access he had. No marshals were sent to Greenvale. No further investigation was conducted. His report remained in that locked cabinet, accumulating dust. In November 1867, Whitfield resigned from federal service. He joined the Frury Edmunds Bureau, believing he could make a difference, that federal power would be used to enforce emancipation and protect freed people from exploitation. Greenale taught him otherwise. The system wasn't broken, it was designed to fail. Years later, in 1894, during an interview with a historian researching Reconstruction, the elderly Whitfield spoke about Greenale. "I've seen many injustices in my life," he said, his voice trembling with suppressed rage. But what happened at that plantation was something different. It was slavery with a legal veneer. It was hope weaponized as a tool of control. And the most disturbing part, the people trap. They had the very documents that were supposed to guarantee their freedom. They had freedom papers, official government papers, and those papers meant absolutely nothing. The historian asked what had ultimately happened at Greenale. Whitfield shook his head. "I don't know. My report disappeared from federal archives sometime in the 1870s. There's no official record that the investigation ever happened. As far as the government is concerned, Greenale was closed in 1866 and everyone left. But I know what I saw. 347 people trapped in plain sight, holding worthless papers and waiting for a freedom that had been sold to the highest bidder." Before we continue with the full story of Greenville, how it happened, why it happened, and what became of those 347 people, I need to ask you something. If you're fascinated by the forgotten stories of American history, the ones that authorities tried to bury, the ones that reveal uncomfortable truths about how power operates, subscribe to this channel right now and hit that notification bell. These stories matter. They're not just history. They're patterns that repeat until we recognize them. And I want to know, what state are you watching from? Drop a comment below telling me your location, because these events happened in communities just like yours and their echoes are still with us. Now, let's go back to the beginning. Let's discover how hundreds of people could hold freedom papers and still never leave the plantation. To understand Greenale, we need to travel back to the final months of the Civil War, when the Confederacy was collapsing and the entire social structure of the South was about to be torn apart and rebuilt. This is where our story truly begins. April 1865, the end of the war. The Greenvale estate occupied 1,700 acres of bottomland in Washington County, Mississippi, in the heart of the Delta region. Some of the richest cotton-growing soil in the world. Before the war, the property had been valued at over $300,000. A fortune built on the labor of 412 enslaved people whose names appeared in ledgers as property, their monetary value calculated alongside livestock and equipment. The plantation had been in the Hayes family for 3 generations. Virgil Hayes's grandfather had purchased the land in 1802 when Mississippi was still a territory. His father had expanded it, buying adjacent properties and increasing the enslaved population. Virgil, 43 years old in 1865, had inherited everything when his father died in 1861, just months after Mississippi seceded from the Union. Unlike many planters who'd volunteered for Confederate service, Virgil Hayes never joined the Army. He claimed a medical exemption, a convenient heart condition that required him to avoid strenuous activity, but somehow never interfered with his management of the plantation. His neighbors whispered that he paid for the exemption, that his health was fine, that he simply valued property over patriotism. Hayes didn't care what they whispered. He stayed at Greenale throughout the war, maintaining production even as the Confederacy crumbled around him. Hayes was not a typical planter. He'd been educated at the University of Pennsylvania, studying law and commerce before returning to Mississippi to take over the family business. He read newspapers from New York and Philadelphia. He corresponded with businessmen in Boston. He understood that the war would end, that slavery would end, and that the planters who survived the transition would be those who adapted quickly and ruthlessly. So, while other planters raged about the approaching Union Army, Hayes planned. The enslaved people of Greenale knew something was changing long before official word arrived. In early 1865, as Sherman's armies carved through the South, news traveled along invisible networks, whispered conversations between properties, information passed from Union scouts to field workers, rumors that grew more concrete with each passing week. Freedom was coming. The question was, what would freedom look like? Among the 400-plus people at Greenville, there were families who'd been there for 3 generations, children who'd been born in those cabins, elders who'd known no other life. There was Jeremiah, 43 years old, who'd been field foreman for 20 years, trusted by Hayes to organize work crews and maintain productivity. There was Ruth, 51, who'd raised 3 children at Greenale before they were sold away, who now worked in the main house kitchen and heard every conversation Hayes had with visitors. There was Samuel, 25, who taught himself to read by sneaking books from Hayes's library, who understood that education would be crucial in whatever came next. There was Flora, 38, who'd lost her husband to fever and her daughter to sail, who had a sister working on a neighboring plantation. There was Adelaide, who'd arrived at Greenale only 5 years earlier, sold from a property in Louisiana, who still carried the faint hope that she might find her husband, who'd been sold to Alabama. These weren't abstract concepts of enslaved people. They were individuals with histories, relationships, dreams, and an acute understanding that the world was about to shift in ways they couldn't fully predict. When news of Lee's surrender reached Washington County in mid-April 1865, the reaction among white planters ranged from fury to despair. Some burned their cotton rather than let it be seized. Others fled to Texas or Mexico, abandoning properties entirely. A few, like Hayes, waited to see what would happen next. The enslaved people of Greenville gathered in small groups after the day's work, speaking in low voices about what Lee's surrender meant. Would freedom be immediate? Would they be given land? Would former owners be forced to pay reparations? Nobody knew. The uncertainty was almost as difficult as the bondage itself. Hayes watched these conversations from the windows of the main house. He didn't try to stop them. Instead, he studied the dynamics, noting who spoke with authority, who others listened to, who might become leaders in whatever new system emerged. He was gathering information, preparing for the next phase. June 1865, the announcement. On June 15, 1865, Union soldiers arrived in Greenville, the county seat, and assembled the population in the town square. A captain read from a proclamation. Slavery was abolished throughout the United States. All formerly enslaved people were now free. Freedom papers would be issued to anyone who requested them. The Freedmen's Bureau had been established to help facilitate the transition. The crowd of black faces listened with expressions ranging from joy to disbelief to caution. Some wept. Others stood silent, waiting to see what freedom would actually mean in practice. The soldiers stayed in Greenville for 3 days, setting up a temporary office to begin issuing documentation. Hundreds of people came from surrounding plantations, standing in lines that stretched for blocks, waiting to receive the papers that would legally confirm their new status. But the soldiers were overwhelmed. There weren't enough of them. They didn't have sufficient supplies. The bureaucratic process was chaotic. Many people were told to return later, that papers would be issued over the coming weeks and months. The soldiers distributed a few hundred certificates, then moved on to the next county. leaving behind promises and a skeleton staff at the Freddie Eadman's bureau office. At Greenville, Hayes watched this unfold with cold calculation. He didn't prevent people from traveling to Greenville. He didn't rage or threaten. He simply observed, waited, and then made his move. The morning after the soldiers left, Hayes called a meeting. He had a large bell installed near the main house specifically for this purpose. When it rang, people knew to assemble. It was a sound they'd heard countless times before for roll call, for announcements, for punishments. The sound itself carried the weight of institutional control. Over 300 people gathered in the open area in front of the main house. Some had been to Greenville and received freedom papers. Most hadn't. The lines had been too long, the process too chaotic, and there was always the fear of leaving the property and not being allowed back to collect belongings or find family members who'd remained. Hayes stood on the front steps of the house, elevated above the crowd, his position reinforcing the hierarchy even as he prepared to speak about freedom. He wore a well-tailored suit despite the June heat. His expression was neutral, almost friendly. "You've heard the news," he began, his voice carrying across the assembled crowd. "The war is over. The Confederacy is defeated. Slavery has been abolished. You are, according to federal law, free people." He paused, letting that sink in. Some people shifted uncomfortably. This was the man who'd owned them, controlled every aspect of their lives, profited from their labor. Now, he was calmly acknowledging their freedom. It felt wrong somehow. "I want to be clear about something," Hayes continued. "I respect the law. I accept the outcome of the war. I will not stand in the way of your freedom. Any person here who wishes to leave is absolutely free to do so. I will not stop you. I will not pursue you. Your freedom is real and I acknowledge it." This was not what people had expected. They'd anticipated rage, threats, perhaps violence. Instead, Hayes was offering something that sounded almost like capitulation. But those who knew him best, Ruth, Jeremiah, a few others who'd observed his patterns over years, felt a warning tingle. Hayes never did anything without calculation. However, Hayes said, and there it was, the qualifier they'd been waiting for. "I want to talk to you about what freedom actually means in practical terms. Because freedom without resources is not really freedom at all." He painted a picture of the world beyond Greenville and every word he spoke was technically true. He talked about the towns where freed people were being turned away from jobs because white workers refused to work alongside them. He described the violence erupting in cities where racial tensions were exploding. He mentioned the reports of freed families starving on roadsides turned away from towns unable to find shelter or work. He noted that land ownership was being contested, that northern speculators were buying up property, that the Freddie Eadman's bureau was understaffed and overwhelmed. Every point was accurate. The post-war South was chaotic and dangerous. Freedom had been declared, but the infrastructure to support it was minimal. Many freed people were indeed facing desperate circumstances. "I'm not telling you this to scare you," Hayes said, his tone almost paternal. "I'm telling you this because I want you to make informed decisions. You're free. But freedom requires planning. It requires resources. It requires knowing where you're going and what you'll do when you get there." He let that settle, watching faces in the crowd. Some people nodded slowly, others looked uncertain. A few like Samuel remained skeptical, arms crossed, waiting for the real message. "Here's what I'm proposing," Hayes said. "I'm offering contracts for free labor. You stay here, work the land, and receive wages, $10 per month. That's fair market rate for agricultural work. I'll provide housing, food, and medical care as part of the arrangement. At the end of the harvest season, you'll receive a share of the cotton profits. Within a year, maybe two, you'll have accumulated enough money to leave with real resources. You'll be able to buy land, start businesses, support your families. You'll leave Greenville not as desperate refugees, but as people with means." He gestured to the property around them. "This land has been your home. These cabins have housed your families. You know this work. You know me. Yes, you were enslaved here, and that was wrong. The law has recognized that. But this can be a bridge to your future. Use what you know, earn what you can, and then leave when you're truly ready. It was a masterful speech. Hayes had acknowledged the moral wrong of slavery while positioning himself as a pragmatic helper. He described real dangers while offering a solution. He'd framed continued labor at Greenville not as subjugation, but as strategic planning. Jeremiah raised his hand. Hayes nodded to him. "What about the Freedom Papers?" Jeremiah asked. "The soldiers said we need official documentation." "Absolutely," Hayes replied. "And you'll get them. I've already made arrangements with the county clerk's office. A certified clerk will come here next week to issue proper freedom papers to everyone. You'll have official federal documentation of your status. And those of you who choose to accept my labor contracts will have both your freedom papers and your employment contracts. Everything legal. Everything documented." A woman named Dinah spoke up. "What if we want to leave before the year is done?" Hayes's expression remained pleasant, but his eyes hardened slightly. "The contracts will be for a full term, 1 year. That's standard for labor agreements. If you break the contract early, you forfeit accumulated wages." "That's not me being cruel. That's how contracts work. Employers need reliability. But I'll also include a provision. If you complete your contract term, I'll write you a letter of reference. That letter will be valuable when you look for work elsewhere. It'll show that you're reliable, skilled, hardworthy." Another voice: "What about our families? Some of us have kin on other properties." "You're free to visit on Sundays," Hayes said. "That's your rest day. As long as you're back for Monday work, your personal time is your own." The offer sounded reasonable, suspiciously reasonable. But the alternative, walking away with nothing, heading into an uncertain and hostile world, was terrifying. Hayes gave them 3 days to decide. "Talk among yourselves. Think carefully. I want people who choose to be here, not people who feel forced. And for those who decide to leave immediately, I respect that choice. I'll provide a week's worth of food rations as a departure gift. That's more than I'm legally required to do, but I believe it's the right thing." Over the next 3 days, the people of Greenville engaged in the most important conversations of their lives. Families gathered in cabins after dark, debating. Some argued for leaving immediately. Freedom meant nothing if you didn't take it. Others advocated for Hayes's plan: accumulate resources, then leave with leverage. A few suspected a trap, but couldn't articulate exactly what the trap was. Ruth spoke with a group of older women, those who'd seen decades of life at Greenville. "He's never done anything that didn't benefit him," she said quietly. "Never, not once. If he's offering this, there's something in it for him that we're not seeing." "But what choice do we have?" Another woman replied. "I'm 61 years old. I can't walk 100 miles to Memphis. I can't start over with nothing. At least here I know where the next meal comes from." Samuel gathered younger men and women, those who dreamed of freedom their entire lives. "This is the moment," he urged. "We might never get another chance. If we stay, we're choosing to remain here. Maybe the world outside is hard, but at least it's ours." But others countered, "Hard. People are dying out there, starving, being attacked. At least here we're alive." Jeremiah, who'd held authority as field foreman, found himself paralyzed by the decision. He'd spent 20 years following Hayes's orders, maintaining discipline, keeping production efficient. He'd been given slightly better food, a slightly larger cabin, small privileges that created a buffer between him and other workers. Now that buffer felt like a chain. If he left, he'd be just another freed black man with no status, no connections, no resources. If he stayed, he'd be what? Still following Hayes's orders, but for wages this time. Flora thought about her sister on a neighboring plantation. If she left Greenville, she could try to find her, maybe travel together to wherever freed people were gathering. But her sister might have already left. They might miss each other completely. At least if Flora stayed put, her sister would know where to find her. These were the calculations of people trying to navigate freedom with incomplete information, limited resources, and the trauma of a lifetime of bondage affecting every decision. Costs for cotton gin operation, transportation to market, storage fees, equipment maintenance, property taxes, insurance, administrative overhead, and 100 other line items. By the time he'd finished, the operational costs totaled $9,800. That leaves a net profit of $1,400. Hayes said. According to the contracts, workers are entitled to a share of net profits after expenses. I'm distributing that amount proportionally based on each worker's contribution over the year. $1,400 divided among $280 people meant approximately $5 per person. The silence that followed was absolute. Workers stared at Hayes in disbelief. $5 after a year of labor, after working harvest hours that stretched 14 hours per day. After picking a pound 40,000 of cotton by hand, each person was receiving $5 as their share. Jeremiah found his voice first. $5. The cotton sold for $11,000. Gross revenue, Hayes repeated patiently. Not profit. Running a plantation is expensive. I've itemized every expense. It's all documented. You're welcome to review the accounting. But reviewing the accounting meant passing financial documents that most workers couldn't read, verifying expenses they had no way to check, and challenging numbers that Hayes controlled completely. This isn't what we expected, Ruth said, her voice shaking. I understand your disappointment, Hayes replied, his tone sympathetic. It was a challenging year. Cotton prices weren't as high as projected. Costs exceeded initial estimates. But I've been fair in the distribution. Every worker is receiving their proportional share based on the actual profit. Thomas stepped forward. According to my account, I should have earned $120 in wages over the year. Your ledger shows $48 and now you're giving me $5 more. That's $53 total for a year of work. The difference is deductions, Thomas. Housing, food, medical care, tools. It's all itemized in your individual account. I can show you line by line. I don't believe your numbers. Hayes's expression hardened slightly. Are you calling me a liar? The question hung in the air. Dangerous. Thomas had no proof. Only his certainty that the numbers didn't add up. But certainty without evidence meant nothing. I'm saying the numbers don't match what I expected, Thomas said carefully. Expectations and contractual reality are different things. I fulfilled my obligations under the contracts. You've received fair compensation based on actual financial performance. Hayes then made his next move, the one he'd been planning all along. I'm offering new contracts for the coming year. Those who wish to stay can sign on for another term. Based on this year's performance, I'm adjusting terms slightly. $12 per month base wage with the same deduction structure. I'm confident next year's cotton crop will be stronger and profit shares will be higher. $12 per month sounded better than 10, but everyone understood the game now. The $12 would be eaten up by deductions. Expenses would multiply mysteriously and next year's profit share would evaporate just like this year's had. And yet, what choice did they have? Most workers had accumulated less than $50 over the entire year. $50 wasn't enough to relocate, buy land, establish a new life. Leave now and they'd be starting over with almost nothing. Stay one more year and maybe they'd accumulate enough to actually escape. It was a trap built on sunk cost fallacy. They'd already invested a year. Walking away meant accepting that the year had been wasted. Staying offered the illusion that the investment might eventually pay off. Over the following week, most workers signed new contracts. The alternative, leaving with $50 and no plan, was too terrifying. But Samuel refused. January 1866. Samuel's departure. Samuel had spent the year since emancipation learning everything he could about the new world emerging around them. He'd saved $28 despite Hayes's deductions. It wasn't much, but it was enough to try. On January 8, 1866. Samuel went to Hayes's office and informed him that he wouldn't be signing a new contract. I'm leaving, Mr. Hayes. My contract term is completed. I fulfilled my obligations. Hayes didn't argue. His expression was almost sad. I'm sorry to hear that, Samuel. You're a good worker. Are you sure about this? The world outside can be harsh. I'm sure. Where will you go? North, Memphis, maybe? Hayes nodded slowly. Well, You're absolutely free to go. I wish you the best of luck. Stop by the office tomorrow morning. I'll have your final wage payment prepared and a letter of reference. That letter will be valuable when you look for work. Samuel was suspicious of Hayes's easy acceptance, but legally there was nothing Hayes could do to prevent him from leaving. The contract term was over. Samuel was free. The next morning, Samuel collected his $28 in actual currency. The first time he'd held that much money in his life. Hayes gave him the promised reference letter written on official letterhead praising Samuel's reliability and work ethic. Ruth, Jeremiah, Flora, and several others gathered to say goodbye. Ruth hugged him fiercely. "Send word when you get where you're going. Let us know you're safe." "I will," Samuel promised. He walked down the long dirt road away from Greenville, his freedom paper and his money hidden securely on his person, the reference letter folded in his pocket. He didn't look back. Ruth watched from her cabin until he disappeared from view. Then she returned to her daily routine, wondering if she'd ever see Samuel again, if he'd be the one person who actually made it out and sent word back. Weeks passed. Then months. No letter came from Samuel. The silence was crushing. Ruth tried to maintain hope. Maybe Samuel was still traveling, still settling, still trying to find a way to send a message. But as January turned to February, and February to March, the silence became impossible to interpret as anything other than ominous. 79 people had now left Greenville since emancipation. 63 in June 1865, 16 more at various points over the following months, including Samuel. Not a single one had sent word back. The statistical impossibility of that silence finally convinced Ruth and the others of what they'd been afraid to fully accept. Something was happening to people who left Greenville, something terrible. March 1866, Adelaide's investigation. Adelaide, the woman who arrived at Greenville in 1860 from Louisiana, had spent 6 years watching, learning, and surviving. She had a quality that Hayes hadn't fully appreciated. She was patient, methodical, and very, very observant. While others had reacted emotionally to the situation, Adelaide had been documenting. She couldn't write well, but she could count and she could remember. She'd been tracking, clears throat, Hayes's movements, noting patterns, building a mental map of his activities. She'd noticed that every time a worker left Greenville, Hayes made a trip to Greenville within the following week. He always went alone, always returned within a day, and always seemed slightly more relaxed afterward, as if he'd completed some important business.